Dr. Anthony Fauci now says he's not sure exactly how coronavirus came to infect humans and left open the possibility that the virus could have come from a lab.
Are you still confident that it developed naturally?
No, I'm not convinced about that. I think that we should continue to investigate what went on in China until we find out, to the best of our ability, exactly what happened.
To be clear, Dr. Fauci never said that COVID-19 did not come from a lab. What he said was there was no scientific evidence supporting that it did. And later in that very same interview, Fauci said investigators still say the spread was likely natural, meaning zoonotic, starting from an animal that transmitted it to humans, which has long been the explanation that was more broadly considered as likely, that it began in Wuhan's seafood market, where there were also a number of animals. So how did we get here? With America's most prominent public health expert saying that the lab leak theory, which was previously hawked by conspiracy theorists, might actually be credible. The lab leak theory that the coronavirus pandemic originated in some fashion in a laboratory in Wuhan has been circulating in the United States almost as long as the virus. One of the first elected officials to promote this theory was Senator Tom Cotton, who said this back in February of 2020.
We don't have evidence that this disease originated there, but because of China's duplicity and dishonesty from the beginning, we need to at least ask the question to see what the evidence says.
Now, Cotton clarified that he didn't think that China intentionally released the virus, but this lab leak theory became a popular hypothesis in conservative circles around that time. In April of last year, a Washington Post columnist highlighted State Department cable's warning of safety issues at the lab in Wuhan. CNN and other news organizations also reported that U.S. intelligence and national security officials were investigating whether coronavirus may have spread from a Chinese laboratory rather than the market in Wuhan. Former President Trump said this when asked about it.
We're looking at it. A lot of people are looking at it. It seems to make sense.
In that same news conference, Dr. Fauci was less than enthusiastic about the theory, though.
The mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
Now, that was April of last year. New coronavirus cases were quickly increasing. Lockdowns were in place in key states, and many Republicans were trying to turn blame for the worsening situation from Trump's policies to China. The National Republican Senatorial Committee even reportedly sent candidates a memo that told them this, quote, "Don't defend Trump other than the China travel ban, attack China." And 2 weeks later, this was Trump.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have. There's a lot of theories, but yeah, we have people looking at it very, very strongly. Scientific people, intelligence people, and others.
And what gives
and
you?
We're going to put it all together. I think we're going to have a very good answer eventually.
And what gives you?
And China might even tell us. China may tell us.
And what gives you a high degree of confidence that this originated from the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I can't tell you that. I'm not allowed to tell you that.
That same day, the New York Times reported that senior Trump administration officials, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, had pushed spies to find evidence linking COVID to the Wuhan lab, and that Trump wanted to, quote, set the stage for holding China responsible.
Have you seen anything that gives you high confidence that it originated in that Wuhan lab?
Martha, there's enormous evidence that that's where this began.
Pompeo never, though, shared that evidence. At the time, Dr. Fauci insisted the evidence showed the virus almost certainly evolved naturally, and it was a circular argument to suggest otherwise. The lab leak theory remained a fringe idea until as recently as March of this year, when former CDC Director Robert Redfield told our Sanjay Gupta this.
I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory, escaped.
Just a few days later, the World Health Organization released its report on the investigation into the origins of COVID. And the report concluded that the lab leak theory was, quote, extremely unlikely. But the scientists had restricted access to Chinese labs. New information is still coming to light. In fact, just this week, the Wall Street Journal reported that 3 researchers from Wuhan's virology lab were not only sickened in November of 2019, they went to the hospital with COVID-like symptoms weeks earlier than China's first official COVID case. Wuhan's lab director told the Global Times the claims in the Wall Street Journal story are a, quote, complete lie. Complicating all of this, China has not been forthcoming about the origins of COVID from the very start. And for Trump, the question of the lab theory was less about finding the truth and more about finding a scapegoat, as he made racist comments deflecting from his own poor political performance and coincided with higher rates of hate crimes against Asian Americans.
It's got all different names. Wuhan. Wuhan was catching on. Coronavirus, right? Kung flu, yeah. Kung flu. COVID-19.
Science will eventually figure it out. It's not unusual for respiratory pathogens that are being worked on in a laboratory to infect a laboratory worker.
Millions of people have died of COVID-19. So it's not a matter of score settling or blame assignment to figure out where it came from. If you want to prevent the next global pandemic, you have to figure out how this one started. And so the World Health Organization said it would get to the bottom of it. The World Health Organization, of course, is beholden to China. And so it tried to hide the basic facts of the origins of this pandemic. And to hide those facts, WHO appointed none other than Peter Daszak as the only America-based representative on the investigative team looking into where the virus came from. In what turned out to be a sham report, that team concluded that it's, quote, extremely unlikely that the virus came from the Wuhan lab. Again, that's not true. The WHO's investigation into the origins of the virus was fraudulent, and that matters to public health globally. But one thing you'll notice is that Tony Fauci did not say that. Why? Because once again, he is implicated in it personally. The gain-of-function research that Peter Daszak was bragging about in the video we just showed you had in fact been banned explicitly by the US government. There was a federal moratorium on the funding of exactly the kind of gain-of-function experiments that went on in the Wuhan lab to disastrous effects. So why didn't the US government halt its funding of the lab in Wuhan? That is a central question, and Nicholas Wade, to his great credit, looked into it. And here's what he found. Quote, someone wrote a loophole into the moratorium. The moratorium specifically barred funding of any gain-of-function research that increased the pathogenicity of the flu, MERS, or SARS viruses. But then a footnote on page 2 of the moratorium document states that, quote, an exception from the research pause may be obtained if the head of the U.S. government funding agency determines that the research is urgently necessary to protect the public health or national security. And that's exactly the loophole that was exploited. Who signed off on this? Tony Fauci, possibly along with Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, invoked that special exemption in order to keep funding the Wuhan lab and the deadly experiments that were going on there. The experiments that clearly went so wrong. According to Richard E. Bright, quote, unfortunately, the NIAID director, that'd be Fauci, and the NIH director exploited this loophole to issue exemptions to projects subject to pause, preposterously asserting that the exempted research was, quote, urgently necessary to protect public health or national security, and thereby nullifying the pause. This wouldn't have happened if Tony Fauci didn't allow it to happen. That is clear. It's an amazing story. It is a shocking story. In a functional country, there would be a criminal investigation currently underway into Tony Fauci's role in the COVID pandemic that has killed millions and halted our country and changed it forever. So why isn't there a criminal investigation into Tony Fauci's role in this pandemic? Mike Gallagher is a member of Congress from the state of Wisconsin. We're happy to have him on the show tonight. Congressman, thanks so much for coming on. To read this piece by Nicholas Wade, who I who I think is as eminent as any science writer in the world, it makes me wonder, why didn't we know this before, and why isn't any law enforcement agency doing anything about it?
Well, Tucker, if you'll remember a year ago when those of us were suggesting that the lab leak hypothesis just needed to be investigated, we weren't saying that it was the correct hypothesis. We were called bigots. We were called tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists. And the problem, and the mainstream media did everything possible to spread CCP propaganda and shut the voices of those who merely wanted that hypothesis investigated, because a global pandemic completely overturned and destroyed our lives and forever changed our country. But now we know that there may have been U.S. taxpayer funding that went to gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the evidence continues to stack up in favor of the lab leak hypothesis. Even China's version of the CDC dismissed the wet market hypothesis. So why won't the mainstream media ask basic questions of Dr. Fauci, given that they have him on every single Sunday show every week? Instead, he gets asked questions about seasonal mask wearing and how we're going to have 80% of Americans vaccinated and kids are going to have to be vaccinated. They're asking him every question except for the questions that matter. We need to get to the bottom of this. If for no other reason, as you suggested, we can't allow this to happen again. And more to the point, there are those proposing that we are going to increase funding from over $200 million to $1.2 billion for gain-of-function research. That would be insane if indeed the lab leak hypothesis is correct, as I think the evidence suggesting it might be.
I think I've misread the story from the first day. I imagined that the media blackout on the origins of coronavirus was designed to protect the Chinese government. But the U.S. government is implicated in this deeply. The story that Wade tells is of incompetence on the Chinese side and then lying and authoritarian, all the kind of predictable Chinese government behavior. But on the American side, you see people going around a moratorium on dangerous experiments, Tony Fauci signing off on it. And those are the people, the Americans who made this possible, whose, I would call them crimes, are being covered up by the media in this country.
And to put Daszak on the WHO investigatory team makes absolutely no sense, because he has a clear conflict of interest. His entire livelihood, his entire professional reputation is bound up in the very idea of gain-of-function research. We had other American citizens nominated to be on that team that the Chinese effectively vetoed, and they put Daszak on the team. Even the head of the WHO, Dr. Tedros, said that the investigation was incomplete and we need to examine the lab leak hypothesis. Again, I don't see a more pressing question in the world, and the fact that people in the media, people in our own government don't want to get to the bottom of it is a failure on every level. One thing they could do, Tucker, is declassify all the intelligence immediately. The Biden administration can do that, get it out there, full transparency.
This is criminal. I mean, if you were mixing dangerous chemicals in your basement and you blew up the neighborhood and killed thousands of people, you would be criminally liable for that. And saying it was a mistake wouldn't be enough to get you out of those charges. This is criminal. I don't think there's any question. Congressman, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
President Trump now blaming China for not doing more to stop the virus, as the #2 official at the CDC argues in an email that the U.S. was slow to understand how much the virus was spreading from Europe. And Trump claiming the virus came from a lab in Wuhan, even as Dr. Anthony Fauci refutes that idea, telling National Geographic the scientific evidence is very, very strongly leaning toward this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated.
We're going to move on to the next audience question, but if you had to, would you close down the borders?
No. I mean, what you don't want to do right now, we have a president who has propagated xenophobic anti-immigrant sentiment from before he was elected. What we need to do is have the scientists take a hard look at what we need to do. There are communities where the virus is spreading. What does that mean? It may mean self-quarantining. It may be not having public assemblies. But let's not go back to the same old thing. Isn't it interesting that a president who has been demagoguing and demonizing immigrants, the first thing that he could think about is closing down the border. So we need scientists to tell us the appropriate approach, not a political approach.
Okay, let's